During my daughter's harsh 12-hour operation, my lazy son-in-law sent an SMS demanding I transfer $8,000 for his Vegas trip. We'd skipped the hospital visit. I smiled and sent just 5 cents. "Check your balance, loser." He got furious instantly, but that was nothing compared to the revenge I had waiting for the betrayer. Before continuing, subscribe to our new channel, where we tell stories of husbands and wives taking revenge on their insolent children, sons-in-law, and daughters-in-law. My name is Walter Coleman. I'm 64 years old, living in Nashville, Tennessee, at 2314 Elmwood Drive, in a 4-bedroom house I bought when the neighborhood still had elm trees worth the name. 30 years as a CPA will buy you a house like that, if you're careful with numbers. I always was. I'm retired now. Mornings mean coffee on the back porch. Afternoons mean my workbench, where I restore vintage pocket watches, old Hamilton Railroaders, Illinois Bun Specials, Waltham models from before the First World War. People think it's a strange hobby for an accountant, but the two have more in common than most realize. A balance sheet and a pocket watch are both about one thing: making sure everything accounts for itself, down to the last decimal, down to the last tick. Nothing extra, nothing missing. That's the kind of man I am. My daughter Lindsay is 34. She became a nurse, which told me everything I needed to know about her character, the kind of person who moves toward pain instead of away from it. When she called to say she was getting married, I drove 6 hours to meet the man, Brett Holloway. I want to be fair because fair is what I know. When I first shook his hand, he was genuinely charming. He had a way of making you feel like the most interesting person in the room, laughed at my jokes, looked me in the eye when he said he loved my daughter more than anything. I believed him. Lindsay married him 8 months later. I paid for the wedding. $23,400. Catered rehearsal dinner included. The problem started slowly. 6 months in, Brett lost his job. "Layoffs," he said. Lindsay backed him completely. I transferred $2,000, told him to take his time. 2 months became 4. 4 became 8. A year passed, and Brett was working on a startup, which, as far as I could observe from my own kitchen table, meant 10 hours a day on a laptop with online poker and football streams running simultaneously. Lindsay was still doing hospital shifts, still pregnant, still manufacturing excuses for a man who couldn't be bothered to load a dishwasher. When she was 7 months along, they asked to move in temporarily, just until we get back on our feet. That was 3 years ago. Picture a Saturday morning in early May, Nashville warm, that thick green warmth that smells like cut grass. I'm out front mowing, working in straight lines because I can't stand a sloppy edge. I come around the side of the house, and through the living room window I can see Brett on my couch, horizontal, feet on the armrest I reupholstered 2 years back, television at a volume suggesting he's the only person who has ever lived in this house or ever will. I kept mowing. There were the loans. Loans, I should say, with quotation marks the size of highway signs. The car repair, $800. Insurance between payments, $1,200. A business opportunity that was going to change everything, $3,500. A dozen smaller sums after that. Brett received money the way some men receive sunlight, as a natural right, without any awareness that a transaction had occurred. Not a cent returned. 14 separate transfers over 3 years. I kept records. Every one of them. I'm an accountant. The baby turned 8 months old on a Tuesday in May. That same week, Lindsay went for a routine checkup, and the doctor found something wrong with her heart, a defect that had been developing quietly for years, hiding until it couldn't anymore. Critical aortic valve stenosis. 12-hour surgery, minimum, within 10 days. I drove to Vanderbilt University Medical Center before dawn. The cardiac surgery waiting room had padded chairs that weren't comfortable in institutional light that was neither bright nor dim, just relentlessly present. I had a thermos of coffee and a yellow legal pad. The nurse told me it would be a long day. I said I knew. It was 7:47 when they took Lindsay back. I watched until the doors closed. Brett was not there. He'd said he'd come by later, by which I understood him to mean whenever the outcome was clear enough that his presence would read as supportive rather than inconvenient. I hadn't argued. At 7:52, my phone buzzed. I picked it up, expecting something ordinary. It was from Brett. "Hey, transfer me $8,000. Me and the guys are heading to Vegas. Gonna skip this whole hospital thing. She'll be fine, LOL." I read it once. Then I read it again, because I'm a man who checks his work. The television was on with the volume off. A woman at the end of my row was knitting something yellow. The surgical wing doors were closed. I counted to 11. Then I opened my banking app, found Brett's account, and typed in the amount $0.05. In the memo field, I wrote, "Check your balance, son." Sent. Phone in my jacket pocket. Eyes back on the doors. 40 seconds later, the phone vibrated. Brett calling. I declined. He called again. Again. A fourth time. On the fifth call, I turned the ringer off entirely and set the phone face down on the seat beside me. I sat in that waiting room while somewhere behind those doors, a surgical team was cutting into my daughter's chest. And I noticed something happening inside me that I couldn't quite name. It wasn't rage. Rage is loud, and this was quiet. More like a door closing, carefully, with a soft, definitive click. I picked up the legal pad and uncapped my pen. 12 hours is a long time to sit with your own thoughts. Long enough to go through a thermos of coffee twice, to watch the light through narrow windows shift from morning gray to afternoon gold to flat white evening. Long enough to write 14 pages without once writing anything that wasn't true. I started with a list. Every transfer I'd made to Brett over 3 years. Amounts, stated reasons. I added them in my head before I added them on paper. That's the way I work. The total came to $47,300. I stared at that number for a while. Then I wrote beneath it, what did I sign? Nothing. That was the answer. In 3 years of cohabitation, my house, my name alone on the title. I had signed nothing. No lease, no written terms, no formal acknowledgement of any kind. Brett lived in my house the way a barnacle lives on a ship's hull, by being there, without any invitation that could ever be formally revoked. I wrote, I trusted the wrong things, not angry when I wrote it, just accurate. The memories came uninvited. The night Lindsay first brought Brett home for dinner, nearly 4 years back. She'd made pot roast, ambitious, and it turned out beautifully. Brett asked for seconds, complimented me on the house, walked through it with the relaxed ease of a man who becomes comfortable in other people's spaces, without much deliberate effort. He noticed a pocket watch I had disassembled on the side table, a 1944 Belova I was cleaning, and picked up one of the small gears. "Precision work," he said, turning it in his fingers. "How long does something like this take?" "Depends on the movement," I told him. "Could be an afternoon, could be a week. You don't rush it." He smiled. "I respect that." He set the gear down carefully, exactly where he'd found it. I'd taken that as a good sign. A man who respects precision, who puts things back where he found them. I was measuring him with the wrong instrument. The second memory surfaced from about 18 months ago. A Sunday afternoon, Lindsay working a double shift. I came downstairs and found Brett at the kitchen table with my laptop open. Not his. Mine. He closed it when he heard me on the stairs, but not quite fast enough. "Just checking something," he said. "What?" I asked. "Sports scores." He had his own phone, his own laptop, technically, which I had purchased 14 months prior, $890, for work purposes. I looked at him. He returned the expression he'd developed over the previous year. Not quite defiant, not quite apologetic, occupying some practiced middle ground that made it difficult to object to anything specific. I'd let it go. I should have understood then. A man who borrows your laptop when he has his own isn't after the internet access. He's testing what he can take without being asked. At 6 in the evening, a nurse came out to update me. Lindsay was stable. Procedure going as expected. Done by 8 or 9. I thanked her. She went back through the doors. I kept writing. Brett arrived at 7:32. I checked the time. Habit, wearing a clean shirt and an expression he had clearly prepared in advance. Concerned. Devoted. He crossed the waiting room with his hands slightly out from his sides, and I watched him calculate his reception before sitting down 2 chairs over. "Any news?" he asked. "She's stable. They expect to finish within 2 hours." He nodded. A beat of silence. Then I heard the exact moment his register shifted, the way it always shifted when he moved from performance to agenda. "So, you seriously sent me 5 cents? You texted me while your wife was on an operating table," I said. My voice was level. I'd had 12 hours to find it. "You asked for $8,000 to go to Las Vegas. You called it this whole hospital thing." One beat. "You got exactly what that was worth?" Color rose in his neck. He glanced at the other people in the room. Whatever he'd been about to say, he stopped. "We'll talk at home," he said quietly. "Sure," I said. We didn't. Not that night. Lindsay came out of surgery at 8:54, groggy but stable. I sat with her for an hour before the nurses asked me to let her rest. I drove home. Brett's bedroom light was already on. I didn't knock. I went to my room, closed the door, and for the first time in 3 years, I turned the lock, stood in the dark for a moment. Then I sat down at the desk, opened the laptop, and typed into the search bar, "Estate Planning Attorney, Nashville, Tennessee, Martindale, Hubble." Top rated. The results loaded. I had spent 30 years making sure other people's numbers were right, protecting their assets, documenting their liabilities, accounting for their futures in precise legal detail. I had done it for strangers, for companies, for people who paid me by the hour to be careful with the things they'd built. It had never occurred to me to do it for myself. One name stood out. Steve Brooks, 301 Church Street, 11th floor. Top rated on Martindale Hubble. 31 years in practice. Trust and estate law. Asset protection. Real property. I wrote the number down on the legal pad. Then I lay back on the bed with my shoes still on and looked at the ceiling. $47,300. One legal pad full of numbers. One man asleep down the hall who was completely confident that tomorrow would look exactly like yesterday. He was going to be wrong about that, I was already certain. The morning after Lindsay came home from the hospital, I called Steve Brooks's office before 8. A receptionist answered on the second ring. I told her I needed a consultation on estate planning and asset protection. She offered me an appointment 4 days out. I took it. Then I made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table with my legal pad, and got to work. I want to be clear, I'm not the kind of man who acts on emotion. In 30 years of public accounting, I watched people make ruinous financial decisions because they were angry or frightened, and they moved before they thought. I was not going to do that. I was going to do exactly what I'd always done. Gather the data, verify the data, understand what the data was telling me, and then decide. I started with what I knew for certain. The house at 2314 Elmwood Drive was mine. I bought it in 1998, paid it off in 2019, my name alone on the title. I knew this, but I wanted to see it in writing, the way I always needed to see numbers on paper before I trusted them fully. I went to the fireproof safe in the closet off the master bedroom, entered the combination, and pulled the property deed. 4 pages, county stamped. Walter B. Coleman, sole owner. I set it on the table and moved on. Then I pulled the household account files. Lindsay and Brett had a joint account for expenses, utilities, groceries, that kind of thing, and I had been contributing $800 a month to it since they moved in. "Just to cover our share," Lindsay had said at the time. I'd agreed without thinking much about it, the way you agree to things within a family because the alternative is a conversation nobody wants to have. I pulled 3 months of statements and found something that required me to sit quietly for approximately 90 seconds before I trusted myself to continue reading. 3 months ago, a new credit card had appeared on the account, an additional card authorized as a second card holder. I did not authorize this. Based on the timing and the pattern, I was reasonably certain Lindsay had, possibly without fully understanding what she was signing. The card had been used 41 times in 90 days. Total charges, $3,200. I went through every line. Sports betting apps, $1,140. Restaurant charges, not the kind of places you take a recovering wife to dinner, but the kind where you go with other men to watch sports on large screens. $680. A charge I recognized as the website for an online poker platform. $490. Fuel, a sporting goods store, 2 charges from a place called Lucky's Bar and Grill, the remaining $890. I wrote it down. Unauthorized credit card, household account, $3,200. I added it to the $47,300. New total, $50,500. I'm an accountant. I don't make arithmetic errors. Around 10:40, Brett appeared in the kitchen doorway in a t-shirt, surveyed the open refrigerator with the mild disappointment of a man who has decided that whatever's in it isn't quite good enough, poured the last of the orange juice without replacing the cap, and drifted back toward the living room. I watched him go. That's the walk of a man who has never once considered that the floor he's standing on might not hold. The next task required resources I didn't have at a kitchen table. I needed time-stamped, verifiable documentation of Brett's financial behavior over the past 6 months. His movements, his spending, his patterns. My own bank records were partial. What I needed was a professional with methods I didn't have access to on my own. I pulled up the PI magazine directory online. I had come across it during my research the previous night. Tennessee requires private investigators to be licensed through the state, and a licensed directory was the right place to start, rather than a Google search that might turn up anybody with a website. I found a listing for Dana Perkins, 14 years in practice, licensed in Tennessee, specializing in financial behavior documentation and asset location. I called the number. She asked precise questions and gave precise answers, was clear about what she could and couldn't do legally, and didn't oversell. That told me more than a polished pitch would have. She quoted a $1,500 retainer for the initial 6 weeks. I agreed. We arranged to meet the following morning at a coffee shop on West End Avenue. Neutral ground, her preference. Lindsay came home 5 days after the surgery, pale and careful, a row of staples along her sternum that she covered with a soft cardigan. I picked her up myself. She fell asleep in the passenger seat before we'd left the medical center parking garage. I kept the radio off. That evening, Brett appeared with flowers, the supermarket kind, rubber bands still around the stems. He set them on the counter, kissed Lindsay on the top of her head with the efficiency of a man checking an item off a list, and announced he was going to watch the game. When he left, I noticed the receipt on the counter. $14.99 for flowers, $38 for a 12-pack, same transaction. I found a vase, filled it with water, put the flowers in it. Lindsay watched from the couch and said, "Thank you, Dad." I wasn't sure which part she was thanking me for. 2 days later, I was looking for a pen in the kitchen junk drawer when my hand found a folded piece of paper. I opened it. Quitclaim deed, State of Tennessee. Blank form printed from a legal document website. Every field empty. Grantor, grantee, property description. The ink was fresh. In the margin, in pencil, in Brett's handwriting, "Talk to Walter this weekend." He was planning to ask me to sign over part of my house. I stood at that counter for a long moment. Then I photographed the form carefully, folded it, and put it back exactly where I'd found it. Let him think it was still his secret. I had an appointment with Steve Brooks in 3 days. That timing, I decided, was going to work out just fine. Steve Brooks's office was on the 11th floor of a building on Church Street, where the elevators smelled like recycled air, and the hallway carpet was the particular dark blue that communicates serious business conducted here. The receptionist offered coffee. She brought it in a real cup, not a paper one. Brooks was around 60, with the careful posture of a man who had spent decades leaning over conference tables and had decided to do something about his back. He shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from his desk, and said, "Tell me what you're dealing with." I laid it out without editorializing. The loan summary. 14 transactions, $47,300, no documentation. The photograph of the quitclaim deed, with Brett's penciled note in the margin. 3 months of household statements, unauthorized charges highlighted in yellow. Brooks read without speaking. When he finished, he aligned the papers with the edge of his desk. "How long have they been living with you?" 3 years, no lease, nothing in writing." "Your name is the only name on the deed?" "Yes," he nodded. "In Tennessee, without a written instrument, a deed, a signed contract, your son-in-law has no cognizable property interest in your home. An oral promise to transfer real estate is unenforceable under the statute of frauds. That blank form is nothing. It only becomes dangerous if you sign it. I won't, I said. Good. Here's what I recommend. He walked me through it. First, a revocable living trust. The property transfers to a trust entity, the Coleman Family Trust, with me as trustee and beneficiary for my lifetime. I retain complete control. But the house is no longer held in my individual name, which blocks any claim Brett might try to construct through cohabitation or financial contribution. The trust document names the successor beneficiaries explicitly. Brett would not be among them. Second, a revised will with a spendthrift trust provision for Lindsay. Her inheritance would be administered by a trustee I designate, not accessible to a spouse, not reachable by a creditor. If she eventually divorces, the structure simplifies. If she doesn't, the protection stays. Third, a promissory note formalizing the $47,300 debt. Not ironclad without his signature, but combined with my transfer records and any written communications, a workable civil claim. Fee? I asked. $3,800. Trust, revised will, and promissory note. Drafted, notarized, filed. I reached into my jacket and set the bills on his desk. He noted it without comment. We shook hands. On the drive home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while. The specific clarity of a problem that has been properly framed. In accounting, there's a moment when the noise becomes information. This was that moment. I walked in to find Lindsay resting on the couch with the baby monitor beside her, and Brett at the kitchen table with his laptop. He looked up when I came in. "Where have you been?" Errands," I said. He nodded. Then, with the timing of a man who had been rehearsing, "Hey, sit down a minute. I wanted to talk to you about something." He leaned forward, forearms on the table, his sincerity posture. "We're family. Lindsay and I, we're not going anywhere. This is our home now, too. It would mean a lot if we had something official here. A real stake." A pause. "I think you understand what I'm saying." I looked at him. The blank form in the junk drawer, his penciled note. He'd waited 2 days after Lindsay came home to find what he considered the right moment. "I do understand," I said. "I've been thinking about the future, too. Had some conversations today, making sure everything is in order." He smiled, the smile of a man who thinks he's just heard good news. "That's great, Walt. Really good to hear." I said, and went to start dinner. He had no idea that the conversations I'd had were designed specifically to make sure his name appeared on exactly the wrong side of every document I was about to sign. In 12 days, this house would belong to the Coleman Family Trust, which had been structured with one clear purpose. Brett Holloway would get nothing from it. Not through marriage, not through pressure, not through a blank form in a kitchen drawer. That evening, my phone showed an email from Dana Perkins. First report attached. I went to my room, locked the door, a habit that had settled in quickly, and opened the file. 14 pages, time-stamped photographs, ATM receipts. 3 separate trips, over the previous month, to a casino in Tunica, Mississippi. Brett's car in the parking lot, documented. 3 ATM withdrawals from the casino floor. $600, $700, $500, all from the household account I had been funding at $800 a month. Total, $1,800. I added that to the running total. Then I set the phone down and looked at the ceiling. The picture forming in my files was not a complicated one. A man who had found a comfortable arrangement, intended to make it permanent, and was now attempting to make it legally permanent. One blank form at a time. 12 days until the documents were ready. I could wait 12 days. 12 days after my meeting with Steve Brooks, his receptionist called to say the documents were ready for signature. I drove to the Church Street office on a Thursday morning. The notary was already there when I arrived, a compact woman in her 50s, named Barbara, who had the particular efficiency of someone who has witnessed a very large number of people sign very important papers, and has long since stopped being impressed by any of it. Brooks walked me through each document one more time before I signed. That's the kind of attorney he was. Thorough, even when you'd already agreed to everything. The first document was the Coleman Family Trust, a revocable living trust, meaning I retained full control as both trustee and beneficiary for as long as I was alive and competent. The house at 2314 Elmwood Drive, was now legally an asset of that trust. My name no longer appeared as the individual owner of record. The trust did, and the trust's successor beneficiaries had been named with considerable specificity. Brett Holloway was not among them. The second document was a revised will. Brooks had structured Lindsay's inheritance as a spendthrift trust, to be administered by a trustee I designated, not by Lindsay directly and not accessible to any spouse or creditor. If she divorced Brett, the structure would simplify considerably. If she didn't, the protection remained in place. It was a provision designed to protect my daughter from decisions she might make under pressure from her husband. I signed it without hesitation. The third document was the promissory note, $47,300, 6% annual interest, 24 months to repay. Brooks had drafted it carefully, referencing the bank transfer records I'd provided and the partial text chain between Brett and me. It wouldn't be airtight without Brett's signature, but it was a solid paper trail for a civil claim, and it transformed a series of loans into a documented enforceable debt. Barbara the notary affixed her seal to each page. I shook Brooks's hand and walked out into the late morning. On the drive home, I thought about the quitclaim deed form still sitting in the kitchen junk drawer, penciled notes still in the margin. Brett hadn't raised the subject again. He was biding his time, waiting for a weekend when Lindsay was in a good mood, when the atmosphere felt cooperative. He had no idea that the house he was preparing to ask me about no longer existed in the form he imagined. It belonged to a trust now, a trust he had no legal connection to whatsoever. I arrived home to find Lindsay in the kitchen, moving carefully. She was still rebuilding her strength after the surgery, working short nursing shifts 3 days a week, coming home tired but increasingly more like herself. There was more color in her face than there had been 2 weeks ago. The surgeon had said 8 weeks for a full recovery. She was going to beat that, I thought. She always had that kind of stubbornness when she applied it to the right things. She looked up when I came in. "Where have you been?" she asked. "Church Street, signing some paperwork." She watched me with the expression she gets when she suspects there's more to a sentence than the sentence itself. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said. "Everything is exactly as it should be." She nodded and went back to her tea. I could feel her deciding whether to ask more. She didn't. That evening, Brett made his move. He came into the kitchen while I was washing up after dinner, Lindsay already gone to check on the baby, and leaned against the counter with his practiced casual posture. Hands in pockets, weight on one hip, the body language of a man who was pretending he just wandered in. "Hey, Walt, you get those papers sorted? The lawyer stuff?" "I did," I said. "Good, good. So, what did that look like? What did you end up doing?" I turned off the faucet and dried my hands. "I set up a trust for the property," I said. "Updated a few other documents. Standard stuff." Attorney was satisfied. His eyes sharpened for a half-second before he smoothed his expression back into place. "A trust. So, that's good for us, right? For the family?" "It's structured to protect the family's interests," I said, which was entirely true. He nodded, the nod of a man who has decided he's heard what he wanted to hear. "Great. Really great, Walt." He pushed off from the counter and wandered back to the living room. I watched him go. He believed the trust was the cooperative gesture he'd been angling for. He thought for the family included him. He would figure out his mistake eventually, but not yet. 3 days later, Dana Perkins sent her second report. 8 pages, clear photographs, precise timestamps. On 2 occasions over the previous 3 weeks, Brett had spent early afternoons at the Hampton Inn on Donaldson Pike. The photographs showed his car in the lot. The check-in records confirmed the dates. The woman visible in the lobby image, partial face taken at distance, was not Lindsay. I added the report to the folder in the fireproof safe. The picture was almost complete. One more step remained before I moved. 2 more weeks passed. I spent them watching and recording. Brett still hadn't repaid a cent of the $47,300. The quitclaim deed form in the junk drawer had shifted positions slightly. He'd taken it out and replaced it at a different angle, which told me he was still thinking about his timeline, still recalculating. He was patient, I'd give him that. Patient and confident, which is a combination that tends to produce spectacular failures in people who are wrong about their position. I called Steve Brooks on a Tuesday and told him I was ready. The letter went out the next morning by certified mail, formal demand on law firm letterhead, referencing the promissory note and documented loan history, requiring the first installment payment of $1,972 by a date 3 weeks out. Return receipt requested. I know the letter arrived because I was at the kitchen table when Brett came downstairs and found it in the morning mail. His face was worth the price of the certified postage. First, mild confusion, then comprehension, then the color left his face in a slow, deliberate withdrawal, starting at his jaw and traveling upward. He read the letter. Then he read it again. He was holding it with both hands, and the paper itself had developed a faint, precise tremor. Not his hands, technically, but the document, which I'm choosing to note as a distinction. When he looked up, I met his eyes over the top of my newspaper. "What is this?" His voice had gone flat, like a recording of itself. "A letter from my attorney," I said. He set the letter on the table, carefully, the way people set things down when they're trying to manage their hands. "You're suing me." "Nobody's suing anyone. That's a payment request on a documented debt. If payments are made on schedule, this stays civil." He stared at me. I watched the calculation happen in real time. Options assessed, conclusions reached, none of them satisfactory. Then Lindsay came downstairs with the baby and he turned, and I watched him decide that this particular conversation couldn't continue in front of her. "We'll talk later," he said. Controlled. Too controlled. He didn't talk to me later. Instead, he called Lindsay at the hospital. She came home 2 hours early from her shift. I heard them in the bedroom, his voice louder, hers quieter. One phrase came through clearly. "Your father is trying to rob us." Then her voice, lower, then quiet. An hour after she left for the second half of her shift, my phone rang. "Brett, I want to talk about this letter," he said. The aggressive register, charm had failed, so now he was trying volume. "I'm listening," I said. "You can't put together a document and say I owe you money when we're family. That's not how it works." "I have 14 bank transfer records," I said. "Text exchanges, a notarized promissory note. Family is a description, Brett. It doesn't change arithmetic." A beat. Then, "You think you're so smart? I'll tell people what you're actually like. I'll let everyone know what kind of man you really are." I let that sit for exactly 1 second. Then, "Sure. Start with where you were on May 14th at 2:30 in the afternoon." Silence. Not the silence of someone choosing their next words. The silence of someone who has just had a door opened in a room they were certain was locked. 3 seconds. 4. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. But the voice was different now. The aggression gone, replaced by something thinner and less certain, like a bluff held past its useful life. "Okay," I said. "Then there's nothing to worry about." I hung up. I sat at my desk for a while, listening to the house settle around me. The letter had done exactly what I wanted it to do. Not just demand payment. That was almost beside the point. The letter had told Brett something more important, that the man he thought he was living with, the accommodating retired accountant who paid for everything and kept his mouth shut, was no longer the man in this house. A different version had taken his place, one with attorneys and documentation, and a very clear memory for dates. He hadn't seen the trust documents yet. He hadn't seen the revised will. He didn't know that the house he was sleeping in belonged to a legal entity that excluded him by design. He thought the letter was the whole attack. It wasn't even the opening. That night, I woke around 3 o'clock for no particular reason and went down for a glass of water. The kitchen light was on. Lindsay was sitting at the table in her bathrobe. Her phone lay face down in front of her. Her hands were folded on the table with the careful stillness of someone who has been sitting in the same position for a long time. Her eyes were red. A box of tissues sat beside the phone, mostly unused. She'd been too still to use them. She looked up when I came in. I stood in the doorway. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then very quietly she said, "Dad." Just that. One word. But the way she said it told me everything I needed to know. That she had seen something on that phone, in whatever she'd been reading before she placed it face down on the table, and that the world looked different now than it had 12 hours ago. "I know," I said. She didn't ask how I knew. People don't, when they already understand the answer. I didn't say anything when I found her at the kitchen table. I went and got a glass of water, drank it standing at the sink, and looked out the window at the backyard for a moment. The elm at the property line, the lawn still neat from the mowing I'd done that week. Then I turned around and pulled out the chair across from Lindsay and sat down. She was looking at me. Her eyes were dry now, but the kind of dry that comes after, not before. I went to my room and came back with the folder, not the full fireproof safe file, just the printed report from Dana Perkins, the second one. 8 pages, photographs, timestamps, check-in records from the Hampton Inn on Donaldson Pike. I set it on the table in front of her. I hired a private investigator, I said, about 6 weeks ago. I want you to know that before you open that, so you understand why it exists. I paused. I didn't hire her to build a case against Brett. I hired her so that you'd have facts, not just my word for things. Lindsay looked at the folder, then she opened it. She turned pages slowly. I watched her face, not looking for a particular reaction, just watching. There's a specific expression people get when they're reading something that confirms what they already suspected, but had refused to fully believe. It's not surprise. It's more like a rearrangement, a slow interior settling of things that had been held in an uncomfortable position for too long. She got to the 3rd page and stopped, looked at the photographs for a long time. I waited. When she looked up, she said, "How long have you known?" "The second report came about 2 weeks ago," I said. "The first one had the casino trips. This one had more." She nodded. Her hands were very still on the table. "And the letter you sent him, the attorney's letter." "That's real," I said. "He borrowed $47,300 over 3 years. I have the transfer records. I have texts. Brooks prepared a formal promissory note." She was quiet for a moment. "You said you set up a trust. The house is in the Coleman Family Trust. I'm the trustee and beneficiary. I have full control of it for my lifetime. But the successor beneficiaries are designated, and Brett is not among them. Not now, not under any circumstances. I let that land. He will not get this house through marriage. He will not get it through legal pressure. He will not get it by waiting me out." She closed the folder. Put both palms flat on the cover. "I should have seen this," she said. Not to me specifically. To the kitchen, maybe. To the version of herself that had spent 3 years looking away. "You were managing other things," I said. "That's not an excuse." "No," I agreed. "It's not." We sat in the kitchen until the sky outside the window started to lighten. We didn't talk for all of it. Some of it was just sitting, which I think was what she needed. Around 5 in the morning, she made tea and brought me a cup, without asking if I wanted one. That was something she used to do years ago, before the marriage changed the rhythms of the house. At 7:30, she went upstairs. By 9, she was on the phone. I could hear her voice from the kitchen, too low to make out words, but the tone was clear. Courtney Spencer, I assumed, her friend from the hospital. She was asking for something specific, the kind of asking that has already made a decision and just needs a name. I went out to the workbench in the garage and spent the morning with a 1958 Elgin pocket watch I'd been restoring in pieces over the past 2 weeks. A railroad-grade movement, 17 jewels, the kind of thing that was built to last a century and just needed someone willing to put the time in. I found that kind of work useful when I needed to let my mind settle. You can't rush a watch movement. Each part depends on every other part. You work in sequence, and you trust the process. Brett came downstairs at 10:30. I heard the kitchen, the refrigerator, the television. After a few minutes, I heard him move to the hallway, and then the kitchen again. And then what sounded like him standing in the middle of the house, trying to read the atmosphere. Something had changed. He could feel it even if he didn't know what it was yet. That afternoon, while Lindsay was resting and I was back at my desk, I heard Brett's voice from his side of the upstairs hall. Low, urgent. He was on his phone. I caught a few fragments. Need to know what this all means. Documents, I don't know. Legal stuff. Yeah, take a picture. About 20 minutes later, I walked past the study and noticed my desk. I keep the top organized. Active files on the left, reference material on the right, the legal pad in the center, the stack on the left, the folder with the trust summary, the revised will overview Brooks had given me, had been shifted slightly, a few degrees off from where I leave things. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I went to my desk, straightened the stack, and sat down. He'd photographed the documents, which meant he now knew or suspected what the Coleman Family Trust was, which meant the next move was coming. I picked up the phone and called Steve Brooks. "They've seen the trust documents," I said, "or a photo of them." "How much detail?" Brooks asked. "Summary pages, enough to know what it is." A brief pause. "That's fine. The trust is filed and recorded. There's nothing in it he can challenge that he'd have grounds for. What we should probably discuss is the next step." "I was thinking the same thing," I said. The letter arrived by certified mail about 10 days later. Law firm letterhead, Trevor Hicks, attorney at law, Bell Mead office, the kind of address chosen to communicate a level of seriousness that the substance of the letter didn't quite support. I read it at the kitchen table with my coffee. Brooks had warned me something was coming. He hadn't been wrong about the timeline. The letter made 2 claims. First, that Brett Holloway had legally cognizable interest in the property at 2314 Elmwood Drive, based on oral agreements and reasonable expectations established over a period of cohabitation. Second, that Brett was owed reimbursement for improvements to the property, totaling $22,000, itemized in an attachment. I read the attachment carefully. Room repainting, $4,800. I recalled Brett spending a Saturday afternoon with a roller and a can of beige paint he'd bought at the hardware store for $34. New microwave, $2,200. The microwave currently in my kitchen had been $189 at Lowe's. I still had the receipt in a kitchen drawer because I keep receipts. Landscaping improvements, $8,500. Brett had occasionally mowed the back portion of the lawn that I didn't reach on the riding mower. Occasionally. The remaining $6,500 was labeled General Maintenance and Upkeep, which is the legal equivalent of a note that says "and other stuff." I forwarded the letter to Brooks that afternoon. The following morning I met him at the Church Street office. He was unhurried, which I'd learned was his standard register, regardless of circumstances. He read through the letter while I sat across from him. "The oral agreement claim is their strongest argument," he said, "which tells you something about how strong their case actually is. Tennessee's statute of frauds requires any agreement related to real property to be in writing. An oral promise to share ownership, even if you'd made one, which you didn't, is generally unenforceable." He set the letter down. "The improvements claim is creative. Courts can sometimes award compensation for improvements under a theory called unjust enrichment, but the amounts they're claiming are so inflated that any judge who's seen a hardware store receipt is going to be skeptical." "What do I do about it?" I asked. "Nothing for now. We respond in writing, deny the claims, and we move forward with the notice to vacate. That's our next step." The notice to vacate was a formal document under Tennessee law. 30 days written notice to an at-will tenant to leave the premises. No lease, no written agreement. The relationship was exactly that. At will, which meant the property owner could end it with proper notice. Brooks had the document ready. He'd prepared it the day before. We drove to Elmwood Drive that afternoon. Brooks had suggested the in-person delivery. Cleaner documentation, harder to dispute later. Brett was in the living room when we walked in. He looked at Brooks with the expression of a man who registers an unfamiliar face in a familiar space and immediately understands it means trouble. He looked at me. He looked at the envelope in Brooks's hand. Brooks introduced himself by name and firm, professionally and without warmth, and handed Brett the envelope. "Notice to vacate," he said, 30 days from today. Brett took the envelope, opened it, read it standing in my living room. What happened next took about 4 seconds. He read, his jaw tightened, his face moved through something that started as disbelief and arrived at a kind of cold, focused fury. Then he tore the paper, cleanly down the middle, then across, dropping the pieces on my living room floor. "You're not serious," he said. His voice was quiet in the way that precedes volume. Brooks reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He photographed the torn pieces on the floor, then looked at Brett with an expression of complete professional neutrality. "Thank you," he said. "That'll be attached to the filing." Brett stared at him. What filing? The unlawful detainer action, if necessary. Brooks said. You've received valid notice. The date is 30 days from today. If you're still present after that date, we proceed to court. He turned to me. I think we're done here. We walked out. I closed the front door behind us. On the walkway to his car, Brooks said, without looking at me, he tore it in front of a witness. That's going to be useful. I thought it might be, I said. What I didn't tell Brooks, what I kept to myself on the front walkway, was that Brett had built his entire strategy on the assumption that the other person would eventually back down. That discomfort would outweigh any potential gain, and that accommodation would continue indefinitely, because that's what it had always done. He had never encountered someone who had decided, quietly and completely, that the answer was simply no. He was encountering it now. That evening, Lindsay knocked on my study door and came in. She sat in the chair across from my desk, the reading chair I keep by the window, and folded her hands in her lap. I made an appointment, she said. A family law attorney. Courtney gave me a name. I waited. I'm not going to fight you, she said. About the house, the trust, any of it. I looked it up. I understand what you did and why. She paused. I'm going to do this on my own terms. I know, I said. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I recognized, the same one she used to give me when she was a teenager and had made a decision she knew I'd approve of, but wasn't going to ask permission for. The expression of someone who has stopped asking for confirmation and started acting. Okay, she said, and got up and left. I turned back to my desk. The folder with the torn notice photographs Brooks had emailed me was open on the screen. I printed it and added it to the file. 30 days. The clock was running. The 30 days between the notice to vacate and the deadline were, in their own way, the most instructive month I'd spent in that house. Brett did not leave. I hadn't expected him to. Men like Brett don't leave when they're told to leave. They recalculate. They tell themselves the other side will blink first, because the other side has always blinked first. He continued living at 2314 Elmwood Drive, the same way he'd always lived there, with the unhurried confidence of a man who believes the rules apply to everyone except himself. He made himself breakfast in my kitchen, watched football on my television, used my internet connection to run whatever online poker tournament he had entered that week. Nothing outwardly changed. What changed was everything else. I had become a different kind of observer. In the 3 years before the surgery, I had watched Brett's behavior with the low-grade frustration of a man who has decided that keeping the peace is worth the cost. I was done with that calculation. Now I watched the same behaviors with the focused attention of someone building a record. Not emotionally, not angrily, just accurately, the way I had always built records. He stopped contributing to the utility bills. Not that he'd contributed much, but the small amount he'd occasionally put toward the household account dropped to 0. I documented it. Dates, amounts, notes. I kept a log in the same yellow legal pad I'd started in the surgical waiting room, which felt appropriate. I photographed the recycling bin full of beer cans 3 days before pickup. I noted the Saturday afternoon when he had 4 friends over to use my back porch and my gas grill without asking, and I took photographs from the upstairs window with a timestamp clearly visible on my phone. Not because I was angry, because documentation is how accountants fight. Lindsay had moved her sleeping arrangements to the guest room the week after our kitchen conversation. She and Brett were still in the same house, which was awkward for everyone, but she moved through it with a quiet steadiness I recognized from when she was young, the particular composure of a person who has made a decision and is waiting for the machinery of it to finish running. About 2 weeks into the 30 days, her attorney, a family law specialist named Rebecca Cole that Courtney Spencer had recommended, filed the divorce petition. The grounds included documented infidelity. Dana Perkins's report, the one with the Hampton Inn photographs, went into Lindsay's attorney's case file. I hadn't provided it directly. Lindsay had requested a copy from Dana herself, which she was entitled to do since she'd been the subject of the investigation in a meaningful sense. That had been Lindsay's call, not mine. The first payment due under the promissory note came and went without any transfer from Brett. I had expected this. Brooks had expected this. We noted the default formally and added it to the record. 4 days after the payment deadline passed, Brett knocked on my study door in the early evening. I was at the desk, working on the Elgin pocket watch. I'd been assembling the mainspring, a delicate operation that requires patience and steady hands. I set the tweezers down carefully and said, "Come in." He stood in the doorway with his arms folded and the expression of a man who has been rehearsing something. "I want to talk." "All right," I said. He came in, didn't sit, positioned himself in the middle of the room with the particular body language of someone who wants to appear relaxed, but is doing the opposite. "Look," he said, "this has gone far enough. I'm willing to drop the whole thing. The lawsuit, the attorney letters, all of it, if you're willing to drop yours." I looked at him. "That's not how the promissory note works," I said. "The debt exists regardless of whether we like each other. I'm talking about being reasonable. I'm always reasonable. I'm an accountant." He shifted his weight. "Listen, I'll leave, okay? I'll pack up and go. No court, no eviction, no drama. You get what you want." A pause, calculated. "But you write off what I supposedly owe you. Clean slate." I regarded him over the top of my glasses for a moment. He was watching me with the expression of a man who believes he's just offered something valuable. "You know," I said, "this reminds me of something. Back in May, you sent me a message asking for $8,000 while your wife was in surgery. And you know what I sent back?" He went very still. 5 cents, I said, which was exactly what that request was worth. I paused. "What do you think your offer tonight is worth?" He stared at me. Something moved in his face. Anger, first, and then something colder underneath it. "See you in court," I said, and turned back to the watch. He left without responding. The front door didn't slam, which surprised me. Maybe he was saving his energy. The hearing was 2 days away. Davidson County General Sessions Court occupies a building on 2nd Avenue North that smells like paper and central air conditioning and the particular institutional patience of a place where disputes get resolved, whether people want them to or not. I arrived early, which is my habit. Brooks was already in the hallway outside the courtroom, reviewing the folder. The folder was 87 pages. I know because I'd helped compile it. Bank transfer records covering 36 months, the promissory note, Dana Perkins's complete reports, including all photographs and timestamps, the certified mail receipt from the demand letter, and the photographs Brooks had taken of the torn notice to vacate, lying on my living room floor, plus a 31-page chronological log I had kept since the morning in the surgical waiting room. Dates, events, observations, all of it formatted in the grid structure I'd been using for records since 1987. Brett arrived with Trevor Hicks, his Bellmead attorney. Hicks had the careful confidence of someone who charges $400 an hour and considers it important that this be apparent. He and Brooks exchanged the neutral nod of opposing counsel. Brett saw me in the hallway and looked away, not quickly enough to be dramatic about it, just the slight, controlled averting of a man who has decided the optics of eye contact are complicated. Judge Maureen Betts took the bench at 9:15. She had the precise efficiency of someone who has heard a very large number of landlord-tenant disputes and has developed firm opinions about documentation. When Brooks submitted our exhibit packet, she opened it to the first page and spent about 45 seconds reading. Then she looked at Hicks. Hicks made his argument cleanly and professionally. Oral agreements establishing cohabitation rights, reasonable expectations over a 3-year period, improvements to the property, unjust enrichment. He cited relevant case law. He was good at his job. Brooks responded with Tennessee Code, annotated Section 66-28. Any agreement related to an interest in real property is unenforceable unless it is in writing. He cited the same case law, and then he cited 2 more. He set the photograph of the torn notice to vacate on the clerk's table without comment. Then he submitted the itemized list of claimed improvements: the $2,200 microwave, the $8,500 landscaping, alongside the actual receipts I had kept from the hardware store and the appliance store. The real numbers were $189 and $34, respectively. Judge Betts looked at the receipts, then at Hicks's itemization. A small but unmistakable expression crossed her face, the expression of a judge who considers something an insult to her intelligence. The hearing took 40 minutes. The property interest claims were dismissed. No written agreement, statute of frauds, no cognizable claim. The improvements claim was dismissed. The actual receipts demonstrated substantial inflation, insufficient evidence for unjust enrichment. The eviction was granted. Brett Holloway was required to vacate 2,314 Elmwood Drive, no later than 1 week from that day. On the promissory note, the documented debt of $47,300, plus accrued interest of $1,420, was confirmed as an enforceable obligation. 30 days to arrange payment or face collection proceedings. Hicks gathered his papers with the focused efficiency of a man who wants to finish this task and never think about it again. He and Brett exchanged a brief, low conversation near the door. Brett's face during that conversation was the most interesting thing in the room. The jaw was tight, the mouth pressed into a line, the eyes somewhere between furious and somewhere much quieter and more resigned. He looked like a man who had been very certain about something for a very long time and had just been informed, by a judge in a government building, that he had been wrong. Brett walked out of the courtroom without looking at me. Hicks followed. Brooks and I stood in the corridor. 40 minutes, Brooks said. That's what happens when the paperwork is in order, I said. We shook hands and parted. I sat on a bench in the hallway for a moment, not because I needed to, but because I wanted the quiet. I took the Elgin pocket watch from my jacket pocket. I'd finished the assembly 2 days before, a 17-jewel railroad movement, 1958, running perfectly now after 6 weeks of careful work. I listened to it tick. A pocket watch doesn't know it's been repaired. It just runs. That's the whole point. I put it back in my pocket. A week later, Brett's car appeared in the driveway at 6 in the morning and was gone by 11. 2 duffel bags, a laundry basket, a plastic hard-sided case with his poker set. On his final trip out, he paused at the front door and looked back at me standing in the kitchen doorway. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. He drove down Elmwood Drive and turned left at the corner and was gone. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in 3 years. That evening, Lindsay came down from putting the baby to sleep and found me on the back porch with 2 cups of tea. She sat in the other chair without being asked. We looked at the yard for a while, the elm at the property line, the lawn still neat, the last of the summer light going gold across the grass. After a while, she said, "I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." "You saw it," I said. "You just needed time." She was quiet for a moment. "Then thank you for not saying, 'I told you so.'" "I'm an accountant," I said. "I deal in facts, not sentiment." She laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh in a long time. It sounded exactly like I remembered. We sat on the back porch until the light was gone and the fireflies started up at the edge of the yard. The baby monitor on the porch railing was quiet. The watch was ticking in my pocket. The numbers, as they always do when the work is done right, had balanced. If you like this story, subscribe to our new channel and listen to several stories there. You will find a link to it in the collaboration or description of this video, or in the comments. Subscribe so you don't lose us, because this channel will soon cease to exist.